it's very easy to visit a museum and just sort of wander around and half look at things, especially if you're with friends.
Yeah.
My experience is I really have to go alone. And one thing that I was really interested in talking to you about is there is an art to visiting a museum. And so, a lot of people will read your book and enjoy it. They might not be able to visit the Met easily themselves. They might live in the DC area, though. They might be able to go to the National Gallery, for instance, or they might have a smaller scale, some kind of local town museum or something. And I'm interested in what's the best way to get something out of whatever museum you have access to. What's the best way to visit? Like I find I go because I have easy access to it living in Manhattan. It's walkable. I go to St. Vincent Ferrer. It's walkable from my parish. I usually go in for 45 minutes and then I stop because my eyes are about to fall out of my head from looking at all these, Greek vases. But what do you think? What tips would you give people for, getting the most out of their museum visits and doing it in kind of an intentional way? And not that wandering around isn't always so productive in its own way.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big problems that people have in museums. They're not intentional. I mean, it's hard to be intentional. You don't know what you're looking for necessarily. Mm-hmm. So the one thing I would do is which is the opposite of what we do in the pilgrimage in some ways, because you really need a skilled guide with you to do the pilgrimage the way that we do it.
Right.
I think what you should do, in my estimation, is concentrate on half a dozen works and do a little research ahead of time what half a dozen you're looking for. If you read the pilgrimage, you'll see, Thomas, you might have recognized a pattern. I mean, as everything else I write, it's very non-didactic, non-scholarly. It's more experiential. But in the experience, there's a formula that you'll begin to see we use to try to unlock what's going on here. And the formula is not applied in a kind of symmetric, scientific fashion. But roughly speaking, for me, to really understand a painting at great depth, the first thing you need to do is to understand the context of the time. What's going on at the time in the history of the time, the culture, and in the artist's own life. And that takes a little bit of research, but you could do that in advance. This is very different than the way a lot of cultural projects today work. I mean, people insist on transporting what's going on in our time to interpreting stuff being painted, 500 years ago. But I would start with the context. And then the second is to do a little work from an art history book about the art itself and some of the symbolism in it. Again, this would be non-spiritual in nature, usually. But it is important to understand, okay, what's going on here, just factually. But then if it's biblical, certainly going back and reading the biblical examples would help a lot. And it's surprising how few art historians necessarily do that. But then I think that will help you unlock the Word of God, which is really what's going on here. And so then I think it's a question of meditating, maybe for a long time, on the painting.
Yeah.
Until you really start to see some of the richness and the depth, and some things you won't see. I mean, there's an El Greco at the Met, which is only on display now and then, called "The Curing of the Blind Man." Are you familiar with that painting? It's on display right now in the Lehman Gallery.
Okay.
It moves around the museums. Another thing that's difficult, but
right.
And, it's a painting that El Greco painted, I think, it was early in his career, but El Greco's a kind of, mystic painter.
Right.
Growing up in Crete, which, important to know at the time in the mid 1500s was a refuge for the Byzantine icon painters that had been thrown out of Constantinople after the fall to the Turks,
Right.
in 1462 or something. And yet it was controlled by the Venetians. So the Venetian Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance there. So, El Greco kind of grows up in this island gumbo. And one of his early works is this Curing of the Blind Man. And it's at the Met. And you see there Christ having this encounter with the blind man. And I always tell, our missionaries that our goal is to have an encounter with someone that we want to get their name, like, find out what's going on in their lives. Right? Jesus is having an encounter with this man, and there's this melee going on around him. To his right are all these Pharisees and other hoi polloi that have been demanding a sign, but are so busy with things of the world. They're pointing at things going on in traffic or trading rabbits or something, or pigeons. And they kind of just completely miss the entire miracle. They're like, their backs are turned to Christ. The blind man's parents are witnessing what's going on, but you can see them becoming nervous. They're worried that this is going to pull them into some conflict with the Pharisees. So some people encounter Christ saying, like, what's this really going to cost me? Kind of thing, And others ignore him. And then, you got the apostles, Peter trying to lend Christ an assist. He's holding his hand out. And then John, I always get people to see John because he's up above the other apostles. He's standing on a stool or something, but he's unshaven, non-bearded, he's young. But he's witnessing this encounter in a very special way, the gospel of love, right? Mm-hmm. And he sees, and of course, this story is in John. By the way, we know it's John because if you see the opening of the fifth seal, which is also at the Met occasionally, painted 40 years later, which is about John, it's the same face. So El Greco had this image of John for 40 years. But what's really interesting, Thomas, is if you go back and look at this painting or check it out in the pilgrimage, you'll see this dark shadow between Jesus and the Pharisees. And at first you won't even notice it. It's like one of these Rorschach tests almost. We didn't see it the first several times that we visited the painting. But John's actually looking at it. And if you read what our historians have to say about it, most of them say, well, it's unfinished work. This was probably going to be one of the helpers lifting the blind man up. And I'm thinking to myself, it goes back to like reading the gospel. There is no reference to a friend lifting him up. He's alone when Jesus encounters him. So it could be anyway. I mean, I'm not saying that's not possible, but if you look very carefully, what it really is, it's an evil spirit being driven out of the man. He's being exorcised by Jesus because, of course, that's what Jesus is actually doing. I mean, he's physically curing us, but more importantly, he's spiritually curing us, right? And
wow.
And El Greco understood that. And I think you do have to bring eyes of faith to a painting to really understand what is going on. And the real drama of the scene is completely different if this is just another magic trick versus, my goodness, we're witnessing an exorcism here.
Right. Yeah, we've been talking about understanding the kind of the content of a painting or the subject matter of a painting. There's also like the just appreciating the visual form of a painting. And for me, I'm not a super visual person. My background is music, and I was a little intimidated when first starting to go to museums, and I got over it just by exposure, But one thing I found helpful with both with both visual art and poetry was to not feel like I have to do something with it, or like I have to get some specific thing out of it, or like I'm worrying about whether I'm understanding it properly, and just allowing myself to behold it, to really just look at it and let my eyes wander over it, or in the case of the poem, to read it out loud, being very helpful, and experience it in a sensory way,
Yeah.
and not just like, am I understanding what's behind this kind of thing. So it's good to have background knowledge and to look at things in their proper context, but also I think just to allow yourself to contemplate something without having to think about it too much. Ideally, those things go together, obviously, because the background knowledge informs without dominating your experience, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'd even recommend that that's a whole different way of looking at a painting and can be really helpful. Um, and if you have time, it's almost worth doing both on different days, even.
hmm,
So going back, there's certain paintings in the pilgrimage that really almost encourage that kind of meditative assessment of, not really assessment, just absorption by it. There's a wonderful painting. They might have put it in storage briefly, I think, because they're redoing that Western painting section right now. But it'll be back, by Raphael, called "The Madonna and Child," and it's painted during
yeah.
the High Renaissance. And Raphael paints it in a way that just pulls you in through that use of mathematical perspective. And I mean, I could go on about the intellectual aspects of this painting and also the spiritual ones, but I think for me, one of the great powers of that painting is sitting in front of it and just maybe praying or